I left. I suppose that some would say that I was a coward, but I wasn't. I'd have stayed if there had been anything to stay for. I was a faithful husband and loving father who had lived his life for his family, and was too disgusted to stay. My wife had another man on the side, my kids were in college, my parents had passed, and I was free. I had decided that this was the time to start the next phase of my life, and I was moving on. This is the story of my departure. Day 1, Sunday. It was not long after sunrise when I pulled in my dock lines and headed out to the bay. Like most boatyards, my lines were my own and I would need them when I reached my destination. They were just one more item on the short list of things that were mine that I would not surrender. I had already surrendered too much. For the past 3 years I'd kept my boat in a marina just north of Annapolis on Whitehall Bay. The Chesapeake Bay had been my home for most of my life and Whitehall suited me just fine. It was a little cheaper than the marinas in Annapolis, and I was never in need of the social life in town. She was a 36-foot cutter designed for cruising named Voyager, and she suited me in every regard. I purchased her with hope that someday when I retired, I would cruise the coast and who knows where after that, but now she was the vehicle that was carrying me to my new life. I'd been a sailor since I was a kid, sailing with my father and siblings in the water around Annapolis. I had raised my kids with boats, and both had become very capable sailors in their own right. They were off to college now, but I had been looking forward to the day when we would sail together again. My wife Sheila never really took to sailing. Once we had the bigger boat, she would go out with us, but for her it was more about seeing and being seen, getting a tan, and looking at all the more expensive boats. Thinking back, I realized how those two realities seemed to define my life and marriage with Sheila. It always seemed to be about impressing others, and whatever she had, she always seemed to want more. I realized now that I couldn't live that way. Whether we grew apart or never really grew together, our marriage had crossed the line and there was no going back. Most of my sailing was limited to day trips with family and friends. I had cultivated a large group of friends who either sailed or wanted to, and there was always someone wanting to get out on the water on a Saturday. We'd leave the problems and cares of life behind, and for just a few hours we'd have nothing to think about but the wind, waves, and markers. Markers are the buoys and pilings that mark the channel and shallow water where an unwary navigator will soon find himself aground. They guide you and keep you in the safety of deep water. The Chesapeake Bay is famous for sandbars and harbor entrances that are anything but straight, but running aground on sand or mud is more embarrassing than dangerous. Seldom is anything broken, and once you've endured a few friendly jabs from passing boats, you are soon off the shallows and back in navigable water. Depth gauges help and modern GPS is great, but a little common sense will go a long way. Although I was mostly limited to day sailing adventures, I did manage to take a few weekend cruises and a very occasional week-long cruise around the bay. Sometimes I had company and a few times I did not, but I had rigged the boat with auto steering by compass and run the halyards aft to the cabin top. One simple, but to my mind critical, addition last year was a safety line that ran fore and aft down the center line of the boat from forward of the mast to the transom. It could be rigged with a moment's notice, and I purchased 2 harnesses to wear in bad weather. If I was ever going to sail long distances by myself, I wanted confidence that I would stay on the boat no matter what happened. Knowing that I was starting the longest voyage of my life, I rigged the safety line and wore the harness before I left port. The line on the harness allowed me to move from bow to stern and go below if I needed to, but it gave me great peace of mind. A sailor comes to think of the boat as an extension of himself, but the truth is that the boat could take on a mind of its own, and this is especially true when rigged for long-distance voyaging. No matter what else happened, Voyager and I were going the distance together. I sailed out of Whitehall Bay and toward the main channel for what may be the last time and turned north to pass under the Bay Bridge. Funny thing that, the Bay Bridge is now 2 bridges, but all the locals still call it the Bay Bridge, not to be confused with the bridge/tunnel down by the mouth of the bay. I avoided the main channel because I wanted to avoid the shipping in and out of Baltimore, and tacked my way north along the western side of the bay. As I sailed, I pondered. Less than 1 month ago I was a husband and father. I was content. How did my life fall to shit so fast, and were there signs that I missed? Did I do something wrong to deserve the betrayal? I was adamant that I had not. I wasn't perfect, but nobody is. Was I being intransigent? Hell yes, I was. Should I stay and fight? If I stayed, what would I be fighting for? Was a cheating wife worth fighting for? And if I won, what was I winning? Did I want to keep a cheating wife? Could I live that way? Could she ever be trusted again? Was she even the woman I married? A person changes with the years and a couple is supposed to grow together. How had we grown so far apart? I had no answers, but I had time to think about the questions, and perhaps by the time I reached my destination, I would have the answers I needed. I passed the entrance into Baltimore Harbor and turned northeast. I was still tacking my way up the bay, working my way to windward, but the shipping traffic was less once I passed Baltimore, and I felt free to crisscross the bay as I tacked northeast. The bay narrows north of Baltimore, and on a good breeze Voyager crossed the bay easily. That means staying topside and staying alert. It was midday when I reached the back creek entrance to the C&D Canal. That would be the likely end of my sailing for day one, so I dropped and furled my sails. You don't sail the C&D Canal, and my limited experience is that the Delaware River never has a breath of wind. You need to be on your toes in the canal because you can cross paths with some very big ships. This day I was lucky, and I had the canal largely to myself. There was just me and one other boat headed toward the Delaware, and one small boat headed toward the Chesapeake. It was an easy passage, and I was soon in the Delaware River headed southeast. I was in new territory now. I'd sailed down to the mouth of the Chesapeake and up to the head of the bay, but I'd never reached the Delaware. The traffic was heavier, but I stayed out of the shipping channel, and by nightfall I had rounded Cape May and reached Stone Harbor on the southern edge of the New Jersey shore. It had been the first of many long days, and I was in no mood for company, but I'd reached the Atlantic. I dropped anchor in an out-of-the-way cove and turned in for the night. I had a growing list of questions and no meaningful answers, but I had time to think and enough to do that I would sleep at night. Day 2, Monday. I hitched my harness to the safety line and left Stone Harbor before dawn. I had a feeling it was going to be a rough day in more ways than one, and I wanted to be prepared for it. I'd lived most of my life in sheltered waters, but this morning I was voyaging into the unknown and I was alone. The wind was moderate and steady from the east, and the seas were higher than I had experienced in the Chesapeake, so I decided to set the Genoa in addition to the main and jib. The extra power would drive us through the waves, and the wind was not too great to carry the extra sail. I suppose at this point I should probably explain something. The two head sails on a cutter are more properly called the Yankee and the staysail, but I grew up sailing sloops with smaller jibs and larger Genoas. I've never been able to shake the language of my youth, so I call Voyager's headsails the jib and Genoa. Everyone seems to know what I mean. As I worked my way beating northeast along the New Jersey shore, I was also checking the weather prediction. There was a tropical depression coming from the south, but it was still 24 hours away, and I had time to make a sheltered harbor this evening. The Jersey shore is famous for having too few good harbors where a sailor can seek refuge when a storm comes up, so I was listening to the Weather Channel on my radio. I had an inexpensive solar array that I could fasten to the cabin top that would produce enough power to run the radio, and could charge the engine battery if the alternator went up on me. Voyager had a small diesel engine, and so far, it had proven utterly reliable, but when you're offshore, you want to keep your options open. The sailors of the old square riggers were always wary of sailing with a lee shore when a storm was coming, so I kept track of the closest harbors both ahead and behind in case I needed shelter in a hurry. Voyager's windward course drove her over the crest of the waves and down through the troughs. As the wind strengthened, the spray increased until it was time to erect some shelter for this lone mariner, so I rigged the Dodger, which offered me the protection that I needed. The Atlantic water is still cold that time of year, and the wind can put a chill in a body, so it was the Dodger or foul weather gear. With the Dodger up, I could enjoy the warmth of the sun, so it was an easy decision. Voyager reveled in the wind and the sea. I was making good time, and with minimal attention the boat would sail itself. With Voyager settled into a rhythm and nothing further to distract me, my mind wandered back to that first horrible night. Sheila and I had worked together to prepare one of my favorite meals. I was grilling skirt steak that we had marinated overnight, and the whole potatoes were wrapped in foil and sitting in the hot coals to bake. She made us a nice Caesar salad and braised carrots with honey. This is how I always pictured our empty nest years. We would indulge ourselves and dedicate our time to one another, but that was not to be. After dinner, and once we'd cleaned the dishes and grill, we sat on the back porch sipping our drinks in what seemed like the warmest evening of the early summer season. It was then that life as I knew it came to an end. "Bill, you know I love you, don't you?" Of course I did. We'd spent half our lives and most of our adult years together building careers and raising 2 kids, and now it was our time. I looked at her and was confused by the expression on her face. Was it fear? "Sweetheart, what's worrying you?" She looked away and into her glass momentarily. "Bill, I've met someone who interests me." 25 years of marriage programs a man to think one way and not another. "Why don't you invite them over to the house? I'd like to know them, too." "It's not that kind of relationship." Now I was confused. "What do you mean it's not that kind of relationship? What kind of relationship is it?" She didn't answer my question directly. "I want to get to know him better." "Sounds good. Like I said, why not invite him over for dinner sometime?" My wife's expression turned from fear to a look of resolve, almost anger. She took a deep breath and said, "Bill, I'm going to have an affair with him. It won't affect us. I'll still be here for you almost as much as I am now." As I sat there on the cockpit sole of Voyager reliving that moment, it occurred to me that I don't remember what happened next. I've read about a fugue state, but I don't think I ever understood it. When I came out of it, Sheila was yelling at me. "Bill! Bill! Damn it, are you listening to me?" I shook my head and reconnected with the world. I mumbled, "Yeah, I'm listening." "Well? What do you think?" "What do I think about what?" "Damn it, Bill, what do you think about what I've told you?" I was numb and mumbled, "You told me you want to have an affair." She was annoyed now. "I told you that I want some time to myself. The kids are adults now and I want a little personal time to recharge my batteries." I thought about saying, "And just exactly where do you plug the charging cord?" But there was no point to it. The very thought of her sex was repellent to me now. "What's his name?" I could feel the anger growing in me. "That doesn't matter. You don't need to know." I screamed. "What's his name, bitch?" I had never raised my voice to her in all the years we'd known each other, and at that moment I was wondering if maybe that had been a mistake. She recoiled, and for a moment I saw a look of fear on her face. That passed. "If that's the way you're going to speak to me, I'm going to my room. You can sleep in the guest room tonight." I thought, "Well, bitch, it's our room, not yours, but right now I wouldn't sleep in the same bed with you if my life depended on it." In my mind I was screaming, but I used every ounce of discipline within me to remain silent. I sat on the back porch for several hours after that, and eventually went to the guest room, but I never slept. I was up and out before her alarm went off. The boat's motion stirred me from my thoughts. The boat had slowed, and it felt sluggish. It was struggling. I looked aloft, and the wind had veered to the southeast, and I decided to change my heading. If the wind hits the sails from too far on the side, they can stall like the wings of a plane. Then the boat struggles and the graceful motion of the hull through the water ceases. It was time to head further east anyway, or I would be converging on the shore. We turned east and I reset the autohelm, but the wind was increasing, so I went forward and struck the jib. After that, the boat settled down into a comfortable motion with only minimal trimming of the main and genoa. If the wind increased much more, I'd need to furl the genoa and raise the jib. I took a long drink from my glass of iced tea, my beverage of choice when sailing, and returned to my thoughts. I had tried to work that day after Sheila dropped the bomb on me, but I didn't get anywhere. She said she was going to have an affair. What wife tells her husband that she is going to have an affair if she hasn't already given him a test drive? If she hadn't already had sex with him, at the very least there'd been a lot of intimate contact. She was already taking time away from us to be with him. I'd known Sheila too long to think she hadn't already had sex with this guy before telling me. She wasn't asking permission. She was notifying me that she was ramping up the affair. I lost control of my temper, grabbed my coffee cup, and threw it against my office wall. That brought my secretary through the door. "Bill, are you okay? What happened?" She could see the hole in the wall with the coffee sprayed everywhere. "Yeah, I'm fine." She looked at the wall again. "That ain't fine. What's going on?" Carol had been with me for over a dozen years. She is roughly my age and had been previously married to a would-be player who couldn't keep it in his pants. If anyone would understand what I was going through, she would. I asked her to close the door and sit. Then I unloaded everything. Carol was shocked, but she was also a great deal more rational than I was. "Bill, it sounds like she started a conversation, but never finished it." I rolled my eyes and began to speak, but she quieted me. "Bill, you need to hear the rest of the story. Maybe she was just thinking out loud or feeling you out. You owe it to yourself to know exactly what she intends to do." She wasn't wrong, but the thought of going back to finish that conversation made my stomach turn. "Bill, are you okay? You're looking a little green around the gills." I took deep breaths to settle my mind and then my stomach. "I think I'm okay. I just can't believe she's doing this." Carol thought for a moment. She was the perfect assistant. There were aspects of my work that only I could do, but so many things that I did poorly. Carol was always 3 steps ahead of me when I needed it. "You need to get your head around this and prepare. Make a list of possible intentions that Sheila might have. List them from least to most hurtful. Then for each possibility, you need to decide how you want to proceed. You can always change your mind, but it will help to get you centered so you know what your options are." I sometimes thought that Carol had missed her calling. She could have been a great, no-nonsense therapist. I nodded and she left momentarily, then returned with a fresh cup of coffee. "Try not to throw this one." She was smiling and her smile was infectious. For the first time, I felt like someone was on my side. I spent the rest of that day working on my list. I'm guessing that Carol must have deflected anyone trying to see me because it's rare that I don't have anyone coming to me for instructions. I wrote and I scratched it out, then I started again. I finally decided to get organized, opened a spreadsheet on my computer, and started my list there. Thinking, typing, ordering, editing, reordering, I explored my options. Somehow, the keyboard settled my mind and the emotions that had overwhelmed me were held in abeyance. My rational mind took control. The longer I thought and the more I typed, the clearer my thoughts became. I had options. I would not be a cuckold. If she felt that our committed life was in the past, then I could put it more completely in the past than she was expecting. It was time and there was no putting it off. Carol had stayed late in case I needed her, and as I was walking out, she said, "Bill, when you get home, turn on the recording app on your phone and record the conversation. You may want to play it back later." Like I said, she was always 3 steps ahead of me when I needed her. I left my work at the office for the first time since I could remember and drove home. All I had was my list and the knowledge that I would not be a damn victim in this. Sheila had obviously made up her mind, but I also had options. As I approached the house, I took deep breaths. My mind was organized and now I needed control of my emotions. I would approach this like any other problem at work. I would be rational, calm, and thoughtful, then I would make my decision once I had all the information. That lasted all of 15 minutes, if that long. She was waiting for me in the living room. I entered, dropped into my chair with my notes, and I waited. "Are you over your little snit? Goddamn bitch in hell," I thought. "Can we talk about this rationally without you yelling and threatening me?" Very calmly, or as calmly as I could manage, I said in a monotone voice, "I have never in my life threatened you. I would appreciate it if you would acknowledge that fact before we start." She looked perturbed and changed her tactic. "Bill, you know I love you. Look at the life we have built together. We have a lovely home, we're comfortable, the kids are grown and in college, and you have to admit that I've been a good wife to you. It's time. I need the freedom to explore new horizons." "New horizons? You mean new dicks for Sheila?" I thought. My mind was screaming, but I kept my mouth shut. This was when I needed to learn what she intended to do. She seemed a bit put out that I hadn't agreed with her. As I said, I've been a good wife to you, but now I want a little excitement in my life. She dropped her gaze for a moment, and then raised her head. I've met someone. You don't need to know who he is. I intend to explore a relationship with him. I'm not in love. I just want that thrill of getting to know someone and having NEW experiences. That last statement took all the self-control I had in me. So you're intending to have an affair, is that right? Yes, Bill. And has this affair already begun? That seemed to catch her off guard, but I can't imagine why. It was an obvious question that she should have anticipated. Then I saw the resolve in her face. No. I wouldn't do that to you. She was lying. I could see it in her face. So exactly what have you been doing with this man? She was flustered. I guess she expected me to become enraged before the conversation got this far. I reminded myself to thank Carol for her cool head and planning. Some lunches, a few dinners, and we went dancing once. That's all. Well, I don't remember being out of town, so I'm assuming the dinners and dancing have something to do with those late nights you've been working? She had the decency to blush, but she said nothing. So you are already lying to me. It's just a matter of degree. That seemed to anger her, but she still said nothing. I could see the defiance building in her face. So exactly how do you see this working? She seemed to gather her resolve and then proceeded on what I came to think was a prepared script. Well, we thought that things could continue as they have for the most part. We? Yes, Gor. I mean my friend and I. So you and George have been planning this together? Sounds a lot like an affair to me. She was getting angry, and for the first time in my adult life I didn't care. She began by repeating herself, a sure sign that she was working off a script, and I began to wonder who had written this script. We were thinking that things could continue as they have for the most part. I might sometimes get home a little later than usual. I stared at her hard. Say the words, Sheila. She tried to act confused, but she knew exactly what I was saying. What words? You might be getting home a little later than usual because you will be at his place, and you want to take your time having sex with him. At least she had the decency to blush again. I suppose. Okay, I get the picture. What else? Again, she wasn't expecting me to move her script along so quickly. I think we'd like to go away occasionally for a weekend. It wouldn't be often, and we wouldn't go any place where anyone would know us. It will never come back at you from anyone we know. I thought about how the best laid plans, and I laughed at my own joke. What's so funny? I shook my head. Nothing. Are you still going to try to convince me that you haven't already been having sex with this George? She gave no response, but at least she didn't repeat her lie. I was working my way down the list that Carol had me prepare. She wants an affair. Check. She's been meeting with him behind my back. Check. She's been lying to me. Check. She's already having sex with the guy. Big check. And she wants to start going away for the weekends with him. That brought me to the bottom of the list. The option I had listed there was divorce. Game over. Let me give you a little gift, Sheila. I'd like you to pack a bag and go to him tonight. Spend a few days with him, and then we can talk again when we're both calm. But I want to stay here and work this out with you, Bill. I am still your wife, and I always will be. I looked at her and began to imagine my hands wrapped around her throat as I squeezed the life out of her. No, you want to leave tonight and spend a few days with your fuck buddy. If you don't go, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. Now the fear I saw in her eyes was palpable. I suppose she finally realized the level of anger that was inside me. I looked at her and I know my eyes narrowed. With a monotone voice and using the last shred of control I had within me, I said, when you take away a man's self-respect, you take away his control of his emotions. You don't want to be here tonight, Sheila. You aren't safe. I didn't need to tell her twice. She went to her room and 10 minutes later she left the house with a small suitcase and drove away. I was a basket case and just sat in my chair until the sun went down. The boat slowed and the sails were luffing. The motion stirred me from my thoughts. The wind had backed to the east. The foresail was still trimmed to port, and was backing while the main luffed. The sails are the means of propulsion, and when they back it's like hitting the brakes. The boat slows and the autohelm loses steerage. Once the boat stops answering to the helm, the backed foresails will turn the boat away from its proper heading and the sailor can do nothing but go with it until the helm recovers control of the boat's heading. There is no dreaming when the boat needs attention, so I tossed the last of my drink over the side, dropped my glass on the cockpit sole, and released the foresail sheets. I had responded in time and there was still enough steerage to alter course, so I turned northeast and set a new heading. I had sailed far enough offshore, and my new heading put me back on my earlier course, although I was further east and out of danger from the lee shore. I trimmed the main and then the genoa until the boat was once again settled into a comfortable rhythm on the new heading and dropped into the cabin to pour myself a new glass of iced tea. For a minute I wondered if the storm had moved inland as it often does in the mid-Atlantic states. No matter. When at sea you deal with the reality before you and prepare for what is coming. There was work to do at sea, but it was nothing compared to the struggle of those last weeks at home, and I chuckled to myself as I briefly remembered the mess I'd been in the morning after Sheila's departure. Then I said a brief prayer of thanks that my father had taught me long ago, that you never drink alcohol while the boat is in motion. You can tie yourself to the mast and drink yourself into a stupor once you're at anchor, but while you're sailing you stay stone cold sober. I took my glass back to the cockpit sole and made myself comfortable. The sails were drawing well, the autopilot was maintaining the set course, and the seas were building slightly, but they were nothing that Voyager and I could not handle. For a time my mind was free of the pain and the crippling sense of inadequacy that I had lived with the past few weeks. Looking aloft at the sails, I placed my hand on the main sheet to feel the force that Voyager harnessed, and thought, there is power there, and there is grace and beauty. The sails drive my boat forward. There is no hesitation or uncertainty. There is only forward motion into a future of my own making. There were no other boats nearby, and feeling confident in my decision to leave, I let my mind drift back to the weeks before. I woke sometime after dawn that morning after our second confrontation. I was a mess. Is this what death is like? I felt disoriented and confused. As the fog in my head began to clear and the events of last night came screaming back at me, a splitting headache consumed my brain. My gut felt like I'd been mugged, but I was both the victim and the assailant. In time, I let my legs fall over the edge of the bed and I pulled myself into a sitting position. Staggering into the bathroom, I took a long look in the mirror. It wasn't a pretty sight. I was a stranger to this type of drinking and could count on one hand the number of hangovers I've had in my life. I won't even attempt to describe what was in the toilet, and I hoped that I'd left it all there and not scattered on the carpets and floors around the house. I heard the phone ring and practically jumped out of my skin. Shut up. Yeah, that'll work. Eventually, the ringing of the phone stopped, which left only the ringing in my skull. I took a bunch of aspirin and sat on the edge of the bed. Slowly and with immense pain it all started coming back to me. The confrontation, the yelling, the slamming doors, it all came back. Fuck! I knew I needed a shower and a toothbrush to get the taste of cat litter out of my mouth. I stumbled back to the bathroom and began the process of getting clean, still running on my own personal autopilot. In time, between the aspirin and the shower, I began to feel human again. Once I gathered my clothes from the night before and dropped them in the hamper, got dressed, and stumbled down the stairs to the kitchen, I was finally starting to think straight. I needed coffee. I was hungry, but the thought of eggs unsettled my stomach, so I grabbed 2 of those boxed pastries that taste like cardboard and dropped them in the toaster. 20 minutes later I started feeling like I could finally take control of my broken life. The phone rang again, and it was Sheila's sister, Bertie. What kind of person names their kid Beatrice in this day and age? Bertie and Sheila. Their parents should do time for child abuse. I picked up the phone and said, "What?" The outburst didn't buy me anything. What's the idea of kicking my sister out of her own house? Who the hell do you think you are? She went on for a time. I put her on speaker, so I didn't need to hold the weight of the phone to my ear, and I just let her go on until she was exhausted. When she was finally done, I said, "Are you finished?" She wasn't, and my question just ignited a new round of profanity. So, having no interest in listening further, I hung up on the bitch. The phone rang again, and I let it ring. 10 minutes later, when it rang again, I picked it up and said, "What?" "Well, it didn't work the first time and it didn't work the second time. What's the idea hanging up on me? Who the hell do you think?" I hung up again. 2 minutes later the phone rang, and a very much chastened Bertie said, "Okay. I'm calmer now. Can I ask you why you think you can throw your wife out of her house?" I just said, "Put Johnny on." "What?" I said, "Put your husband on. I will explain it to him." I knew Bertie and I knew Johnny, and I knew it was time to share the pain. Johnny picked up. "Billy, what the hell is going on?" He always called me Billy, and he was the only one who ever did. I liked Johnny. We could be men together when we needed to and kids together when we wanted to. Johnny was a stand-up guy. "Johnny, I need to tell you something and then you need to think about it. Sheila dropped the bomb on me last night. She announced that she is having an affair and she intends to continue it. She's already fucking the guy and she wants to start spending more evenings and some weekends with him. Plus, she wants me to be okay with it." There was silence on the other end as Johnny digested what I'd told him. "Billy, that doesn't make sense. You want to hear it from her own mouth?" I recorded the conversation. Johnny must have thought about it, because it took a bit for him to get back to me. "Maybe. How about I come over and we can talk?" I told him to pick up some beer on the way over and that I was fresh out of bourbon. He was there 30 minutes later. I told him the story from the very beginning, and I played the recording. The recording was rough, and it hadn't picked up Sheila's voice as well as I would have liked, but it made him a believer. It was then that I began my scorched earth campaign. "Johnny, you've known these two sisters for as long as I have. Would you say that they keep secrets from each other? They never have. So do you think that Bertie knows that Sheila has been having an affair?" He straightened up and for a moment he seemed to be staring off into space. Then he turned back to me and for once I saw a level of anger that gave me hope. "You heard her ream me out about kicking Sheila out of the house? Do you think she didn't know why?" He was hearing every word. I knew this man, so when he said, "I fucking hate a cheat," I knew I'd made my point. Bertie wasn't going to be bothering me again. She had her own problems to deal with. I took a moment from my thoughts to look aloft, then I went to the low side of the boat to get a better look at the jib. The wind was settled, and sails were drawing well, so I sat back on the cockpit sole and resumed reliving the days that led to the end of my marriage. Unfortunately, the argument that ensued at Johnny's house that night resulted in him throwing Sheila out of the second house in as many days. When the knock came at the door and I opened it, there stood Sheila asking if she could come home. I did the mental arithmetic and figured I had control of my temper by then. Besides, my course was chosen. "You can stay under 2 conditions." She nodded, but there wasn't a hint of remorse on her face. "First, you need to tell me if you've ever entertained your fuck buddy in this house." She was quick to respond. "No, I'd never do that to you." "But you'd fuck him somewhere else, right?" She had no answer to that. I had anticipated this and was already preparing for my bachelor life, so I said, "Second, I've moved into the guest room. You can keep our bedroom until the divorce is final." "But," she started, "I'm not interested in hearing anything from you. You can sleep here, but don't you dare bring that asswipe into my house. Do you understand me?" She became defiant, but she nodded yes and went to her room. I didn't see her again for the rest of that night. Sitting alone in the living room, I decided to take advantage of her self-imposed isolation and continued working on my list. Following Carol's lesson, I put my mind into work mode, picked up my laptop, and began a new list. There were bank accounts, investments, retirement accounts, the house, cars, college tuition, and on and on. A man's life can become complicated after 50 years. I knew enough of divorce to know that I'd lose half of everything and more if I wasn't careful. Sheila worked, but she didn't make what I made. The house was largely paid for, and we had created tuition funds for both kids, so I felt their college educations were secure. My retirement would take a hit. I'd negotiate the house, but I had no intention of living there again. It soon became apparent that there were only a limited number of things that I could do legally. Any attempt to hide money was going to fail. The short list of things I could do came down to just 4 things. I could split our simple savings, move some of what we owned into storage in the hope of keeping it, get out of town, and file for divorce. In the end, I surrendered any thoughts of revenge and decided I would settle on freedom and an equitable distribution. In the morning, I split the bank accounts and canceled the joint credit cards. That gave me the resources I needed to make a new start. Then I canceled her phone. That was to get her attention. The investment accounts were in our joint names, and I couldn't do much without her cooperation. The lawyers would handle that. The advantage to my being unable to split those accounts was that she couldn't do anything either. So that also meant they were safe. The divorce would deal with them. Then I rented 2 single-bay storage units in town. I was surprised that night as I checked off items on my list. There really wasn't a lot more I could do, so I began to think about preparations for my new life. The increase in commercial traffic headed south out of New York stirred me from my thoughts. Those big ships can come up on a fellow faster than you might think, so it was time to get my head back in the game. It had been a long day, but by evening I'd made my destination. I struck sail outside the cut at the Manasquan River and found a comfortable harbor just inside shortly before the sun went down. I never like entering a harbor for the first time after dark. It's too easy to lose your bearings. Still, it had been a great, if very long, day, and my mind was clear for the first time in almost a month. The wind had held, even if the seas had grown, but I'd made excellent time. I picked up a berth and paid the harbor master for his trouble. I was 2 days out, and I needed a shower and a shave. Then I needed a good meal. Sailing cleanses the mind, and the sea can be primal. Together, they leave a man thinking of basic things like food, drink, a hot shower, and a comfortable place to sleep. I had one and went in search of the other 3. The marina provided showers for boaters. The good ones usually do. Feeling refreshed, I found a place a few blocks from the harbor that offered fish and chips with a good local IPA, and that ticked off the last 2 items on my list for tonight. I felt content and tired as I walked back to my boat. It had been the second very long day, so I hit my bunk. My last thoughts were of the next day. I suspected that the storm would reach me, and I'd stay in harbor while it blew over. I took some comfort in my safety and was immediately asleep. Day 3, Tuesday. Rain and wind. The tropical depression had reached the New Jersey shore. The rain started in the middle of the night, and it woke me from my slumber. I had lowered the dodger when I secured the boat, and I thought that I had closed enough of the cabin hatch to keep most of the rain out and allow some air in. But a boat at the dock is not free to spin with the wind like it is at anchor, so if the wind comes up behind you, the rain beats in the cabin hatch. The rain was splashing on my face and woke me from my slumber. I buttoned up the hatch, closed and locked the forward hatch, checked the dock lines, and settled back to sleep. Morning came and still it rained. It was going to be one of those days. I'd made good progress, so I could afford to take it easy. Then again, what choice did I have? I sure as hell wasn't going offshore in a baby hurricane. The dock lines were holding, and Voyager wasn't struggling, so I settled down to sleep a little longer. I needed it. When I was finally up, I decided to fix my first hot breakfast of the voyage. I started by boiling some water to make coffee. Drinking it, I began to feel human again. Then I fried some bacon in the pan, diced a small jalapeno and added it to the pan to cook, scrambled some eggs in the bacon grease, added it all to 2 flour tortillas with a good handful of shredded cheddar, and spooned on some salsa verde that I'd brought for exactly that purpose. I turned them both into a tight roll, cut each in half, and sat back to enjoy the sound of the rain with a filling breakfast. I felt truly content for the first time in weeks. I bought Voyager to sail, not to sleep. The cockpit was spacious to allow for better sail handling by a standard crew, while the cabin was small and cramped. With the relatively minor changes I'd made, it was perfect for one man sailing away from his pain. With my meal consumed and a second cup of coffee, I began to think about the day ahead. In time, I would get my foul weather gear and take a tour around the deck. Everything was as it should be. The sail cover was protecting the main, the jenny was furled, the jib was below deck in the forward bunk, and all the halyards were tied off. All was proper, so I returned to the cabin, stripped off my rain gear, and settled in for a quiet rainy day. This wasn't exactly the day I was hoping for. I knew that as I sailed north, I'd have plenty of time to think about Sheila and her betrayal, but I knew that the needs of the boat would provide enough distraction to break up my thoughts. Today there would be no distraction unless I worked to create it. So I looked around the cabin and found the box of books that I'd packed for the trip. It contained only about a dozen books. Some were my favorites, and a few were new. I had packed the books not just for the voyage, but for my new beginnings as well. I didn't know how soon I would get back to retrieve the rest of my possessions, and I wanted something familiar with me to start my new life. Almost instinctively, I picked up Steinbeck's Cannery Row. It had been one of my favorites for most of my life, but now it held a special significance, as if to mirror my own life. Doc was a man of intelligence who appreciated the people around him but lived in a state of self-imposed isolation. I turned to the back of the story and began to read the scene at the end of the book where Mac and the boys throw Doc a party. Doc had friends who cared about him, and soon the party takes on a life of its own. It gets rowdy and the police arrive, until they soon join in the party, and it grows while Doc finds himself on the edge watching his friends enjoying themselves. It somehow seemed an apt metaphor for my own life. There has always been a part of me that is a loner who finds himself surprised by the interest and support of good friends. I knew that in time there would be new friends with unexpected challenges and some old friends as well. This wasn't an end, but a new beginning and a transition of sorts. I needed to pass through this period of isolation so I would be cleansed of the old pain and ready for the new relationships ahead of me. As I read the book, my mind drifted back to the weeks leading up to my departure. Sheila and I were living even less like roommates, and more like ships that passed in the night. We each went to work, although to be honest I never knew whether she was working or seeing her new infatuation. She would get home late without explanation, and I asked for none. We fixed our own meals without concern for the other. She made overtures tinged with condescension to try to get me back into her bed, but the thought of it disgusted me. I gave her 25 years of dedication and affection, but she became bored and needed something new. To hell with her. Meanwhile, I was talking with the upper management at work. I wanted to move, and I was fairly picky about where I wanted to go. As luck would have it, there was an opening in Maine, and that suited me just fine. The company appreciated me, and they were flexible about when I would start. Then Sheila gave me the most convenient opportunity one could have hoped for. It was a Tuesday night about 2 weeks after she dropped the bomb. She came home late as usual and announced, "Since you have no interest in me, I'll be gone this weekend. My friend is taking me to New York for a show. I'll be leaving Friday after work, and I should get home sometime Sunday." "You mean George, or is this a new friend?" I was being snarky and had no desire to apologize for it. She just glared at me and walked back to her bedroom, slamming the door as she went. In the adolescent tit-for-tat that had become our life, I scored that as a victory for me. She was going off to get fucked in New York, but she was getting it here anyway, so what did I care? Plus, this would make it easier for me to leave. Friday morning came and I watched her walk to her car with a small suitcase. She wasn't planning to come back after work, so I began to prepare. I went through my closet packing most of my clothes in boxes that I lined with large plastic trash bags to keep everything dry. Winter clothes were packed for storage and the summer clothes were packed for transport. I packed my books and electronics for storage except those few books I would take with me. Then I packed my tools. There were a few things I wanted from the marriage, like photographs of the kids, that would go into storage. I left all the furniture except for my office desk and chair and a large comfortable leather sofa that Sheila hated. All told, it wasn't much to show for the life I'd lived, but I was never one to accumulate material things. The last items I packed were my guitars. I had an acoustic steel string guitar and a cheap classical. I like the classical because the nylon strings feel comfortable under my fingers, and I could work the strings to shape the notes as I played. The steel string was a lovely machine, but the classical was downright organic in my hands. When I held it, it felt like a part of me. I also had one of those indestructible plastic travel guitars that I usually kept on the boat this time of year. It was always a relaxing way to pass an evening as I savored the day and watched the sun go down. I had already rented 2 single-bay storage units in town and rented a small truck to move my possessions into storage. Saturday morning, a few good friends came by to help me load the truck, and we had everything in storage before lunch. I wouldn't learn until much later that my friends had picked up a few things that they thought I would someday want and added them to my storage unit. I used the second storage bay for my car. From that point on, I'd get an Uber or ask a friend. A man needs good friends, and I never needed the Uber. I took my friends to lunch, and we discussed my plans. I had everyone sworn to secrecy, and as we talked, I was amazed by the disgust they expressed for Sheila. It turned out that my best friends never liked my wife, but they had the good grace to never tell me until that day. Later that night, as I prepared for the longest solo voyage of my life, I pondered the true value and grace of good friends. "So, Bill, what are the plans now?" That was Craig asking. I'd known him the longest, and at that moment the idea of not seeing him again filled me with more pain and disappointment than leaving Sheila. I had asked Craig to hold my guitars for me, not wanting to put them into an unconditioned garage with summer coming on, and he had eagerly agreed. I knew they would be safe with him, and I knew just as well that I would see him again. "I've got a few things back at the house, some clothes and a few books that I'll be taking with me. I figure I'll buy my provisions tonight and get settled on the boat. Tomorrow morning I'll leave and start my trip. You're still headed north? We can't convince you to stay?" That was Pete. I realized now that they were taking turns in the conversation, either deliberately or not, so I would know that they all cared. I shook my head. "Too much pain and too many memories. I've already arranged a transfer at work, and I found an apartment online. That will solve my immediate problems once I get there. Then once things settle down up there, I'll fly back and get my car and boxes. I'll probably need to rent a small truck and pull the car on a trailer, but that's fine. What are you going to do about Sheila?" Jack had a look that can only be described as disgust. "I saw a lawyer the week she dropped the bomb on me. The kids are grown, and she has a job. It will cost me, but that's the way of things. You seem to be taking it surprisingly well. Actually, I'm getting out of town before I kill the bitch." That earned me a laugh, and I had to smile myself. I wasn't exactly kidding, but it was true that I wanted a new beginning and an end to the pain. "So that just leaves one big question." Pete leaned across the table, pushed his glasses up on his nose, and gave me a hard look. It was difficult not to laugh before he finished. Pete is a lovely man and the furthest thing from hard that I've ever known. "What do you want us to do to George, and how do we dispose of the body?" I don't think there was another serious word spoken for the rest of the afternoon. Sitting in Voyager's cabin with an unread book in my hand, the sudden rocking of the boat woke me from my thoughts. The rain was light, so I stuck my head out of the hatch. It was just a lobster boat passing close by, and the wake had broken the stillness of the morning. He was probably getting fuel for tomorrow. I doubt he was heading out of the harbor on this day. I pulled the hatch cover closed and resumed my meditation. After lunch on Saturday, I said goodbye to the bulk of my friends with a promise to send them my contact information once I was settled. Craig drove me to get the last of my things at the house. Then he accompanied me to the food store and dropped me at the marina. After loading my provisions, I invited him to have a drink with me. Yes, I forgot to say that I cleared out the liquor cabinet when I packed, and then I put the cabinet into storage with the rest of my possessions. It turned out the liquor cabinet that I'd built myself years before held better memories for me than the marital bed where our children were conceived. I spent hours, off and on, wondering about that and similar things. It's funny how it took Sheila just 2 weeks to change how I viewed everything in my universe. Craig and I sat in the cockpit of Voyager, sipping our bourbon and talking about the surprises and curves that life throws us. "You don't deserve this, Bill. I hope you know that. This isn't something that you did. You were betrayed and had an unacceptable demand dropped on you. There is nothing else you could have done. I was nodding, and I knew in my heart that Craig was right. I wasn't made for life as a cuckold. You know, next to the Chesapeake, I think Maine is the most interesting place I could settle. It's wooded with farmland and the cities are small. The sailing is good and there are lots of islands to explore with harbors up and down the coast. I think I'm going to like it up there. Craig gave me a serious look and said, Don't forget that if you run aground up there, it won't be a sandbar that you hit. There's rock everywhere you go, and it will tear the keel right off your boat if you aren't careful. The thought had occurred to me. Still, I couldn't let him leave on such a serious note. There's really just one question that worries me. What's that? Can you put Old Bay on a lobster? It was a stupid joke, but we were both Maryland boys born and raised, and we knew that challenges could come from the least expected places. Maybe more to the point, I was looking for any reason to laugh, if only for a moment. These were the last few hours of my life in Maryland, and I knew that nothing would be the same again. You can put Old Bay on anything, Craig said. With that, we clinked our glasses in a toast and sat in relative silence as we finished the last of our drinks. When the sun was going down, Craig stood and said, You know, I've got to get home. Are you going to be okay? I thought for a moment and nodded. I have a lot to work through, but now that I'm committed to a path, I feel like I'm finally going to be okay. I looked at my friend and asked, Are we still on for Boston? Damn right we are. He gave me a hug and stepped off the boat. As he started down the pier, he stopped and turned. You know, none of us are going to tell her where you are. Not your friends, not our wives, nobody. You tell her or don't tell her, but she won't learn it from us. I nodded my appreciation. I had already decided that I wasn't going to hide. I was just leaving her. He looked back several times as he walked to his car. As I stood there watching him leave, I knew I was leaving behind good friends, but I knew, too, that they would remain a part of my life for years to come. I briefly wondered whether Sheila could say the same. Once alone, I finished stowing my gear. I found dry places for the few books and boxes of clothes that I'd brought. Food is in some ways both more and less complicated. Ice keeps a few days at sea if you don't open the icebox, but only a very few days. Steaks last no longer than the ice, and fresh vegetables are about the same. I knew the first few days would be long and I may not have time to cook a real meal, so I bought canned meats and vegetables. They're not fancy, but they feed the machine. Dried spices will keep for a time, but the humidity at sea is high. The best way to inject flavor into a meal is with items like canned chili peppers, basil and tomato pesto, and jars of red and green salsa. Eggs keep if they don't break. Pasta sounds good, but water is slow to boil, and pasta requires too much water. Bread and crackers will keep in sealed plastic bags. After Craig left and my supplies were stowed, I turned in for an early sleep. I'd already informed the marina of my departure, and there was nothing more to do that night. I would be up and leaving early the next morning, so I'd take my sleep while I could. Laying in my bunk, I tried to sleep, but sleep was slow in coming. My mind was a jumble of anger and pain with trepidation over the life I had ahead of me. I was consumed by conflicting doubts and resolve, but in the end, I knew that this was the only course forward. The sound of the water on the hull was soothing until sleep finally claimed me. Turning away from my thoughts, I looked around my cramped cabin and felt strangely at home. I had food, clothes, something to occupy my mind, and a warm, dry place to sleep. It didn't seem like much, but it was all that I needed that day. I decided to set my book aside and hit the bunk to catch a few minutes of sleep. I was still exhausted from my first 2 days and all the preparation before I left. I woke about 2 in the afternoon and fixed myself a plate of cheese and crackers. With a glass of hot tea and a little honey, it was the perfect late lunch. A quick look about showed that Voyager was doing fine, so I settled down with my guitar and snack and played my way into evening. I had spent enough time that day thinking about the past. With it growing dark, I had a bowl of cereal for dinner and turned in early. Tomorrow would be a long day. Day 4, Wednesday. I had another long sail ahead of me, and the North Jersey shore is notorious for having too few safe harbors. I headed out before dawn with the Dodger rigged and my harness on, going down that last stretch of the Manasquan, and I was out in the Atlantic as the sun rose above the horizon. The wind was moderate, but it was enough, and there was a swell left over from the storm the day before. The wind would strengthen as the day progressed, so I spread sail and headed northeast. This was the most dangerous passage of the voyage. I would be crossing major shipping lanes into and out of New York City, and I needed to watch for big boat traffic. All was clear, but I didn't want to spend too much time below cooking breakfast, so I made myself a bowl of cereal and settled onto the cockpit sole to eat and watch for traffic. Day or night, around the clock, the big boats were passing through this part of the coast. The Coast Guard rules say that a boat under sail has the right of way over a boat under power. What a lot of sailors never learn is that this rule applies only to recreational power boats. Sailboats do not have the right of way over commercial traffic, and experience teaches that a sailboat that claims the right of way over a commercial tanker or cargo ship goes to the bottom and the skipper is seldom seen again. I felt like Gulliver in the land of the giants. I spent the day trimming sail and navigating my course between the big ships with little time to think of anything else until I rounded the northern end of Long Island. It was well after dark when I found an anchorage close to shore, and I set the alarm on my GPS in case I dragged the anchor. I was beat. I'd already had 2 bowls of cereal and endless glasses of iced tea, and I was too tired to fix dinner. I settled for a granola bar and a glass of milk, and I went to sleep. Day 5, Thursday. I woke before the sun. My dreams that night had not been pleasant. I was once again reliving the days before I left, the days and nights after Sheila dropped the bomb on me. I looked across the surface of the water and thought, to hell with her. I have miles to make today, so I dressed and started some water boiling for coffee. This was going to be a good day. I was hoping for a strong breeze that would have me making good time, and I would soon be out of the shipping channels. There would still be some big ships, especially until I had crossed Block Island Sound, but I was hoping for an uncomplicated day, or at least as uncomplicated as travel under sail can be. The cabin was cold that morning compared to the night before, and the coffee felt good. It warmed my hands before it warmed my core, and I fixed a bowl of cereal for breakfast. It seems I was eating a lot of cold cereal on this trip, much more than I usually have, but it was convenient, and it filled my stomach. I'd been gone 4 days already, 5 if you count loading the truck, and my cell had been off the entire time. When you're offshore, there is little to no cell reception, but I'd not even thought of turning it on in the harbor at night. The last thing I wanted to deal with was Sheila yapping at me. This morning my thoughts turned from Sheila to my kids, and I wondered if they knew I was gone. I hadn't told them I was leaving. Instead, I planned to contact them once I reached Portland, but if Sheila got to them and knew the boat was gone, she might have them worrying needlessly. Then again, that remark of hers about my little snit was still burning in my gut, and I'd had all of that I ever intended to swallow. I turned on myself for the benefit of my kids and waited while it went through the usual powering up noises. In time I heard the usual cacophony of beeps and dings that told me I had mail, messages, and texts. There were texts and emails from friends who wanted to hear that I was all right. It hadn't occurred to me that they, too, were watching the weather and might be worried for me. Sitting alone in my little cabin, their messages touched my heart. Word was out that I was gone, and I had received a flood of support, but those who knew where I was headed had kept their promise, so everyone wanted to know where I was and where I was going. I decided to send out one group text and told them, I'm well. I've had 3 good days of steady wind, spent the storm in a safe harbor, and I am making good progress. I thought for a moment and decided there was no point in keeping it a secret any longer, so I added, I'm sailing for Maine and hope to be there in a few days. The boat is handling well, and I know now she was an excellent choice when I bought her. She can do everything I ask of her and more. It's a great change. Then I added a smile emoji. I figured they'd get the joke. I did have phone calls and text messages from the kids, and they seemed worried. I had kept them in the dark this entire time and not told them anything about their mother's new lifestyle, but they needed to know why I'd left. They're adults and Sheila made her bed, plus the divorce papers were prepared and had probably been served shortly after I left, so I sent them a short text telling them that I was fine, that I was sailing to Maine, and I promised to tell them more later. I ended by telling them that I loved them and always would. I realized later that my cryptic message may have worried them more, which was not my intent. With that done, I turned to the calls and text messages from Sheila. I considered just deleting them, but information is power, and I figured I could endure hearing her crap one more time. I started with the phone messages. They began with insults and a tirade about how my not being home Sunday night had inconvenienced her. Typical. By Monday she was annoyed and by Tuesday she was pissed. So, it was business as usual. I guess she was served on Wednesday because around noon that day she went off on me. What did she expect? After 25 years, she should have known I'd never put up with that shit. Her most recent calls had shown some small measure of concern, but who knew why or if it was sincere? I listened to them all, but I didn't respond. Then I turned to her text messages, and they followed the same progression from annoyed to pissed to very pissed and back to concerned. No surprises there. I thought of her with George and any concern I had for her dissipated. I decided that I would give her one clear and definitive response, so I texted her that we were done, I'd left her, she had the papers, she should sign them, and that was that. Then I read the one short text from my lawyer telling me that the papers had been served. I'd guessed as much. The simplicity and directness of his message appealed to me at that moment. I had just one more thing to do before I could turn off the cell. I had no idea whether I'd have cell coverage this day, so I sent a text to Craig saying, "Weather permitting, I plan to stop in New Bedford tonight and Plymouth tomorrow. After that, I could reach Boston or Gloucester and then Portsmouth. I'll be out of communication today, but drop me a text and I'll pick it up when I reach the harbor tonight." Craig had been in on my plans from the start, and I had promised to pick him up somewhere along the coast as I moved north. The sun was coming up by the time I'd finished with breakfast and the phone messages, but I had time to savor a second cup of coffee, so I sat in my cockpit and watched the sun rise. It was a new day, and for the first time I felt it really was the start of a new life. I was halfway there and no longer running away from the pain and what I felt was my failure. I was now running toward my new life. The fishermen were already on the water by the time I was ready to pull anchor. The wind was steady from the west, and I set a course northeast toward Buzzards Bay. I was still undecided about how to get past Cape Cod. The idea of sailing further offshore and rounding the Cape to the east was very appealing, but this was my first solo voyage in the open ocean. Besides, I had made other commitments. Once past New Shoreham, I turned 10 degrees to the east and set Voyager on a broad reach to port. The main, Jib and Jenny were all drawing well, and I began to make the best time of the voyage. There was a gentle rolling sea coming from shore, and Voyager was lifting and falling rhythmically as I was putting miles under the keel. I thought, this is what it's all about. I have a good boat beneath me, a steady wind behind me, and a destination calling me. I need more of this and less of what I left behind. I soon returned to the same position that had brought me this far. I sat on the cockpit floor contemplating my voyage, and I watched for ships. There wasn't much to see, and that suited me just fine. If things went as planned, each leg from this point on would be shorter than those along the New Jersey and Long Island coast. From this point on there were safe harbors everywhere along my course, and little to no need to make enough miles to find a safe place to spend the night. As with the days before, my mind began to wander. I wonder why Sheila never could appreciate sailing? It was liberating and exciting, much like I assumed flying must be. The sails harnessed the invisible wind as the sea pounds against the hull as mile by mile it propels you forward. The boat demands your attention, but it gives you time to think as well. Time to think. Why did she think she needed more than what we had? Our life together was always everything that I ever needed. Why was I not enough? What was so magical about this George, and how could she imagine that I would sit by while she was going to bed with another man? That's when it hit me. With all that she had thrown at me, with the condescension and betrayal, I never found out who this man was? Was he someone she worked with? If so, I'd never met him. I don't even remember her mentioning him in conversation. Was he someone new in her life, or had she been keeping him a secret for longer than she admitted? She certainly lied to me about not having already slept with him. Was he someone who came to her office from time to time, or did he only need one short visit to turn my wife's head? My anger flared for a moment, and I gazed off to the eastern horizon to clear my head. Someone was sailing close-hauled on port headed south across the bay. I wonder where he was sailing from and what he was sailing to. Our courses would cross several miles apart, so I reached for my monocular to get a better look. Some people aren't familiar with monoculars, but it's just one half of a binocular. Truth is, they are easier to use on a rolling sea, and I quickly focused on the other boat. There was a man about my age at the helm and a woman coming topside through the cabin hatch. She put 2 mugs on the cockpit sole, exited the cabin, and picked them up again, carrying one to the man who appeared to be her husband. I wonder what that is like, to be sailing with your spouse and sharing the experience with your mate, your partner? They were briefly studying me, or probably Voyager, but were too far away to see me watching them. I suppose that they, like me, were just admiring a passing boat. I smiled, and for a moment I let vanity overtake me. I knew that Voyager was a handsome boat and briefly considered flying the spinnaker, but I was quickly disabused of that notion. A spinnaker would be an encumbrance if the wind shifted quickly, or I needed to change course. I waved, but I was too far away for them to notice. They seemed to be talking, and I saw the man laugh. For the first time since I left Whitehall Bay, I felt truly alone. Until now, I had been a solo voyager, but now I was something else. I was uprooted. I was separate and apart from everything and everyone except Voyager, and for just a moment I wondered what it must be like to share a life with a woman who wanted only to be with me. I shook those thoughts from my mind and reminded myself to turn on my cell when I reached port so I could speak with my kids. I needed to hear their voices and explain my decision. I hoped for their support, but only time would tell how they would respond. Sheila was, after all, their mother. There would be at least a measure of loyalty to her. For the first time, I began to wonder what price I might pay for my new life. I scanned the water ahead of me. There were a few more boats leaving their harbors to sail or fish, but this was a Thursday early in the season, so it would be far from crowded out here. Before long I would be in Buzzards Bay, and by late morning there would be some additional company crossing my path. The image of the man and his wife sailing south lingered in my brain. They looked happy, and I could remember a time when Sheila and I seemed much the same. Before the kids were born, we were carefree, and it seemed as if every day was a honeymoon. When the kids were born, life was even better. When they were little, I helped Sheila after work, so she didn't need to do it all. The kids grew, and we read them stories at bedtime. Then they started school, and we helped them with their homework. It was all the little things a family offers a parent, and I loved all of it. I never felt that I was growing old or that time was slipping away from me. At every age it seemed that I was the perfect age, living the contented life. When did things start to change? I suppose when Sheila went back to work, she was more distracted. I didn't blame her at the time. She'd been a stay-at-home mom for 7 years. She needed some freedom and a chance to be an adult again. Freedom. What an odd word. I thought that the chance for her to go back to work and have adult conversations again was freedom. She thought that having sex with another man was freedom. Now I wonder if we ever agreed on the meaning of that word or the value of our life together. I was making good time, and I wondered when and where I would rendezvous with Craig. Hopefully, I would know tonight. The solo voyaging was exciting, but I had to admit that I was looking forward to some company now. Maybe with Craig aboard we'd be able to show off a little and fly the spinnaker. There's another expression that used to mean something else: showing off. I kept pictures of Sheila and the kids on my desk at work and on top the cabinet behind my chair. Every few years I would add another as the kids grew. I had a beautiful family, and that was showing off. I did pack those photographs when I put my things into storage, although I entertained the idea of cutting Sheila out of them, but she was also a part of my past, and there was no rewriting that. I wondered whether I'd like my new office, and I wondered if the kids would cooperate with a photograph of just the 3 of us to sit on my new desk. Jack had been great. He ran my company's office in Annapolis. When I went to him to tell him what was happening with Sheila, he took off his boss hat and put on his friend hat. He never once made me feel guilty about wanting to leave. Instead, he sat with me and helped me plan. When I told him I needed to leave town and start new, he was the one that told me about the opening in Portland. It was the same company doing the same work in a different town. For me, it was a lateral move. Bill, you know I don't want you to go. I want you to stay here, spit in her eye, and find the prettiest girl in town to take your arm. But you know I went through a divorce for much the same reason as you, and to this day I wish I'd just left town and not looked back. I see that damn cheating bitch and her new husband everywhere I go. You never get used to it. I just sat there nodding my head. He had lived it, and I saw before me what that choice offered. I wasn't going to live that way. I know the guy who runs the Portland office. He's good and he's a stand-up guy. You'll like him. If you want, I'll arrange an interview. I didn't need to think about it. Make the call, Jack. Tell him I can fly up and interview any time that's convenient to him. An hour later, Jack was in my office. You have an interview Tuesday morning. Carol is getting your flights and hotel now. I suggest you stay over at least Tuesday night and look at some apartments. No point in trying to find a house right away. It's best to get the lay of the land first. I flew up Monday night and back home Thursday. By the time I returned, I had a new job, a new apartment, and a place to berth my boat. Things were looking up, and for the first time since Sheila dropped the bomb, I felt I was taking charge of my life. Thinking back, I'd told Sheila I needed to leave town for work, and she never questioned it. She never asked where I was going or how long I'd be there. I suppose that, as much as anything else, told me my marriage was dead. Now I was following a parallel course north, although I was moving more slowly than that jet plane that took me to Portland a few weeks earlier. I checked the map and the satellite navigation and saw that I was approaching the shipping lanes out of Providence. I didn't really expect much shipping here, but there was enough to keep my mind off the past. I climbed off the floor of the cockpit, fetched myself a fresh glass of iced tea, and sat where I had an easy view in all directions. It was time to pay attention. Better than Providence, there is Newport by the mouth of Narragansett Bay. Some people will argue with me, but I think of Newport and Annapolis as the sailing capitals of the East Coast. Okay, some will say that Annapolis is second place, and if we're talking wealth, then it's probably true. Newport was the traditional home of the America's Cup, and like they say, money attracts money. However, I think that on a per capita basis, Annapolis has the greater number of dedicated sailors. There's a lot of one-design sailing there and a lot of handicap racing, too. If you add to that all the professional watermen and amateur fishermen, and you have a lot of boats in a lot of marinas, and a lot of bars going full out late into the night. I passed Newport well offshore and hoped that I might see a 12-meter yacht stretching its sails, but no such luck today. It was a Thursday and early in the season, so only the die-hard sailors were out. I guess that's what I was now. Well, why not? I had sailed a solo offshore voyage up from Annapolis, and I was sailing on to Maine. That's when it hit me I need to start a journal for Voyager. I'd document my offshore voyaging and record the miles and the wind and sea conditions. It would be the record of my new life. It sounded good to me, but I never did it. It was nothing more than a grandiose passing thought. I was always one to live in the moment, and Voyager would be no different. Instead, I would content myself with watching the other sailors watch us as we sailed by, and know that they envied Voyager's lines and the easy way she moved. That was more my style. I was now well past Newport and making good time. The wind had veered to the northwest, and I had trimmed the sails for a beam reach. Voyager was really flying now. I entered Buzzards Bay and the seas lessened slightly. I was past the shipping lanes and there was time now to get a bite to eat. I had a strange craving for an egg salad sandwich, but all my eggs were raw. With no interest in boiling water as the ship rocked with the waves, I settled for a crunchy peanut butter and grape jelly sandwich. It worked so well that I had a second. My appetite was returning, and I thought this was probably a good sign. Food hadn't appealed to me after Sheila had dictated her terms. Nothing much of anything appealed to me then. Now I was several hundred miles from home, and I was putting miles under the keel even now as I thought about it. I was well past the halfway mark and headed downhill. As the afternoon wore on, I saw a few more boats come out, but there weren't many. I told myself that I was made of tougher stuff, and I laughed. I wasn't tough. I just didn't need to be at work. I decided that I'd thought about Sheila and the unbearable crap that I'd left behind me enough for this day, so I lay back on the cockpit bench and watched Voyager as she made her way up Buzzards Bay. She is a thing of beauty. The cutter rig allows me to tune the sails to the changing wind conditions, adding or striking sail, to keep the rig balanced and the helm neutral. A slight adjustment of a sheet, a few degrees on the auto helm, and Voyager would respond. This is what I'd been craving. When I did the right thing, I was rewarded. When I screwed up, she told me. We communicated, this boat and me. We had an agreement, a pact. I would take care of her, and she would not let me down. I struck the sails outside New Bedford Harbor and motored up the river. It was easy to find a berth close to town and restaurants this early in the season, and it was almost as easy to find a hot shower. I returned to the boat long enough to get my cell and read the text from Craig. He would meet me tomorrow night in Plymouth. There were messages from the kids that were full of questions and concerns. I would take my time and answer them tonight. Then, once again feeling prepared for civilized company, I went in search of an Italian restaurant where I could get that pasta I'd been craving. I got a big plate of carbonara and a nice salad with a glass of Chianti, and walked back to Voyager a very contented man. The sun was long down when I returned to the boat, but I felt like celebrating. I was over the hump, the boat was sailing well, and tomorrow night I would have company. After pouring myself a glass of bourbon, I sat back to compose a message to my kids. There was a gentle breeze keeping the bugs at bay, so I sat in the cockpit with my back against the cabin side and gathered my thoughts as I watched the tourists strolling by. People watching had always been a favorite pastime of mine, and I used to sit in the mall and watch the shoppers when I accompanied Sheila on her shopping trips. That was a distant memory. She really hadn't wanted me tagging along for some years now. It made me wonder when the cheating really started. Oh, screw it! I thought. And screw her, too! I'd spent too many years worrying how she felt and what she needed. She wants a new beginning? Well, this was mine. This was the beginning of my new life, and it would begin by sitting on my boat, sipping some bourbon, and gathering my thoughts. I know it doesn't sound like much, but that night it was enough. The locals were heading off to home as I finished composing my message to the kids. I decided to keep it short and to the point. This is going to be hard for you to understand, and I can't honestly say that I understand it myself. Your mother has decided to take a lover. His name is George. I've not met him, and I know nothing more about him, but I have no intention of sitting around while your mother spends her nights in his bed. So I've left your mother. It's no more complicated than that. I've tried to be a good husband. I admit that I'm not perfect, but then no one is. I have been faithful to her since the day we met, and now I must stand up for myself and demand better than she is giving me. You know that I love you both. I am divorcing your mother, but I am not divorcing you. My commitment to you will never waver. I am moving to Maine, and I know that this will complicate your lives as your mother, and I will no longer be living under the same roof or even in the same town. I do regret that this will have an impact on your lives, but I want you to know that in everyone's life there comes a time when they must do what is right for them. I hope your mother finds whatever it is she is searching for, but it will not be with me. Please think about what I've told you and get back to me when you are ready. I will always love you. I do still want and need you in my life. Dad. I was exhausted by the time I had finished my text and started thinking it was time for me to sleep. If the weather prediction held true, tomorrow would be a good day. I'd sail up Buzzards Bay and take the Cape Cod Canal into Cape Cod Bay. Unless the wind veered north, the sailing should be easy, and I could make Plymouth by Friday evening. Day 6, Friday. I slept well Thursday night. Voyager jerked about a little when the wake of passing boats made her tug on her dock lines, but I slept soundly. Then, for the first time since Saturday, I went into town for breakfast. I was missing the protein of my daily diet and got a plate of eggs and bacon with some good coffee and orange juice. Feeling good, I returned to the boat and checked my cell. I had messages from both the kids. As I expected, they were upset, and they had questions. I expected them to doubt my story about their mother and George, but they surprised me. I suppose they were more observant as kids within the marriage than I had been as a husband. Both had seen their mother's selfish side more clearly than me, and they believed what I had told them. They wanted my assurances that I would stay in touch, and that they could come to visit me once I was settled, and I eagerly responded and assured them that they would always have an open invitation and a place to stay with me. I missed them so much, but their love and support lifted my spirits. I don't mind telling you that I sat there in the cabin, and I wept. My wife may have betrayed me, but the kids were standing by me, and that would be enough. When I was ready and my bedding was stored in a dry place, I started the engine, dropped the dock lines, and headed out to Buzzards Bay. The sail up the bay was relaxing. The wind was steady from the west, there were only a few boats out, and I made good time as I sailed for the canal. The Cape Cod Canal is much like the C&D Canal, and I knew I might need to pass near some commercial shipping headed the other way, and while I didn't like the idea, I knew I wasn't the first to do it, and I felt I was ready. It proved easier than I expected. I dropped my sails by the mouth of the canal, and made an easy passage through to Cape Cod Bay. I was getting to be an old hand at this sort of thing. I had time, and Cape Cod Bay is a large, semi-sheltered body of water that is open only to the north. The wind had veered north, which made a more direct course up the coastline impossible, so I set Voyager's course northeast and headed out toward the middle of the bay. It was liberating. I raised the main, jib, and Jenny trimmed the sheets, I'd the engine, and felt the boat accelerate. Voyager was laying over to starboard with the wind in her teeth, and she was charging northeast into open water. She was rising and falling, pitching slightly with every wave, and it felt as if nothing could stop her. It was exhilarating and liberating, and I felt that between the two of us we could do anything. There was barely time to go below and pour myself a drink today. There was no boredom and no sitting on the cockpit sole. I was staying topside with the wind in my face. I let the autohelm drive the boat, but I watched that the sails continued to draw and kept an eye on the electronic navigation. Voyager was in her element and sailing perfectly. She was a thing of beauty, power, and grace. I was now felt that I was charging forward to build a life of my own making. I could build my life anew. I would rise to every occasion. I could meet every challenge. I was ready. That is the feeling that a strong breeze and a good boat can give you, and that is how I sailed into the middle of Cape Cod Bay. I reached the center of the bay and tacked toward the northwest. It was an easy matter. I set a new course for the autohelm, and as the boat turned to port, I released the foresail sheets from the starboard cleats. The sail comes across the center line of the boat naturally, and once across I winched the sheets home and trimmed the sails. The main tacked without attention. It took about 15 seconds from port to starboard tack, and as Voyager accelerated, I marveled at how well everything worked. Of course, with a crew it would all happen faster, but I was doing everything myself. The helm was solid and smooth, the sails were drawing well, and the hull was surprisingly fast. I checked the navigation, and I would easily clear Stage Point, taking care to pass east of Solid Horse Rocks and Marion Rocks, and I would make Plymouth well before nightfall. Sailing northwest, I began to think about navigation and those rocks ahead. In the days before electronic navigation, a skipper earned his keep by knowing his location regardless of the weather. When a fog came in, they still needed to know that they were avoiding the dangers ahead. Those rocks became a metaphor for the decisions that brought me here. How did I not see the rocks ahead when the kids left for college, and we became empty nesters? I had assumed that it was clear sailing, but the fog had rolled in without my knowing it, and there were rocks ahead. Was George the rock, or would it have been someone else if it hadn't been George? And how many rocks had I passed over in the years before, not knowing that destruction was all around me? I told myself there would be no more of that, but like the sailors of earlier days, we cannot live our lives in complete safety. We select our crew, set our course, and prepare for what may come, but there is always a danger lurking, and a man needs a good crew and a solid boat to manage the dangers and reach the safety of port. I chuckled and shook my head. Listen to me. I'm a philosopher sailor. How will I surprise myself next? With thoughts of Sheila behind me once again, I kept one eye on the sails and one on the navigation screen as I raced toward Plymouth. It was a bright and breezy afternoon, and Voyager reveled in the waters of Cape Cod Bay. I had marveled at how well she had handled the wind and waves coming north along the New Jersey shore, but here it was as if she were playing in the semi-sheltered waters of the bay, and I sailed on with a light heart and a free spirit. It was early evening as I slowly motored Voyager into my rented slip, and I saw a familiar form standing on the dock waiting to greet me. Craig had beaten me here. He quickly tossed me each dock line and Voyager was soon resting in place. You made good time. So did you. How did you get here from the airport? Craig laughed. All the world is tied together by shuttles and cabs. It's just a matter of finding your best choice, and I had a day to do it. Craig stepped aboard. He was carrying a canvas duffel bag and looking every bit the sailor that he wasn't. Where did you get the duffel? I used to use it for my laundry in college. I knew it would come in handy again. He was all smiles, and it was good to see him. Just toss your bag below and we'll get a bite to eat. Craig took me literally and tossed his duffel below to the sound of crashing plates and cups. He gave me a sheepish look with just a hint of concern. I was laughing too hard to be angry. I think you hit the sink. I shut and locked the hatch, and we made our way into town. Tonight we would pull out all the stops and have a dinner befitting the moment. We were sailing men and we wanted steak with a glass or two of scotch to go with it. Over dinner I told him of my voyage, and he told me of the goings-on back at home. It was after dark when we made our way back to Voyager. As I unlocked the hatch with the promise of fixing us each a bourbon, I heard a voice behind me say, "Excuse me, sir, are you William Harris?" I turned to see two uniformed officers and the harbor master standing on the dock alongside the boat. "Yes, can I help you?" The older and I assume more senior officer said. "Well, sir, we have an alert to watch for you. May we come aboard?" I looked at their hard-soled shoes and frowned. "We won't take long." With that, the senior officer began to step aboard. "Just a moment. I didn't say yes. If you want to come aboard, you can take off those shoes. I'll not have you scuffing the deck with those soles." Okay, I was being a bit of a jerk, but he could have waited until I responded to his request. It was clear from the look on his face that he didn't like my response, but he complied, and I watched two uniformed officers, two of Plymouth's finest, remove their shoes and step aboard Voyager in their stocking feet. "Take a seat. Get comfortable." I said it a bit tongue-in-cheek. There wasn't much comfort on a hard cockpit bench. The four of us sat in Voyager's cockpit as the harbor master walked back along the dock and waited for the officers. "What can I do for you fellas?" They were beginning to look a bit uncomfortable, and I suspect they were embarrassed. This was probably not their first time at this. "Well, sir, it seems that your wife is concerned about you. She, or perhaps I should say the Annapolis police, contacted the towns along the coast to inform us that you might be passing through. She says you are disturbed." I could tell he didn't like that word any more than I did, and I think he was searching for a better way to say it. "Did she say I'd lost my mind?" I was laughing quietly. "Did she say I was emotionally impaired?" Craig was smiling but trying not to laugh out loud. "She said that you received some disturbing information and might not be behaving rationally." My laughter was no longer quiet, and Craig gave up all pretense of keeping a straight face. "Look, fellas, my wife dropped a nasty bomb on me about 4 weeks ago. She is having an affair and she intends to continue it. Our kids are grown, I was free to make some changes in my life, and I will not be disrespected in that way. I arranged a transfer at work and I'm moving my boat to Maine. It's no more complicated than that." The two officers were nodding at this point, and I think I detected a look of envy in the older fellow. The younger officer looked at Craig and asked, "Are you traveling with him?" "I wasn't, but I am now. He sailed up from Annapolis on his own, but I'll be joining him from here to Portland." The two men looked at me with renewed respect. You sailed this boat by yourself from Annapolis to here? I did. Did you have any problems? Not until now. I smiled at the younger man, and he had the good grace to look a little embarrassed. The older officer looked about the cockpit, glanced forward toward Voyager's bow, and I'll assume he recognized a well-equipped boat that was maintained in good condition. Turning to me, he said, "Well, sir, I'm sorry that we bothered you. You do seem to have everything under control. We'll just wish you a safe trip, and I hope you find the life you're looking for." As we stood, I shook their hands and apologized for having them remove their shoes. They laughed and held no grudge. "Could you pass the word up the coast that I'm not quite as nuts as my wife would have them believe?" They nodded and said they would, and with that they departed. Craig looked at me. "Man, there is never a dull moment with you, is there?" I had no reply for that, so I stepped below to fix us each a glass of scotch. We spent the rest of the night sitting in Voyager's cockpit, sipping our scotch, and watching people go about their business. When it was time, we went below, fixed our bunks, and got some much-needed sleep. Day 7, Saturday. Now that Craig had joined me, the voyage would change. We could sail longer, taking shifts if we wanted. There were ample ports and an abundance of choices. We could take time to visit the offshore islands, change sails more easily and more often, and we could cook while underway. Best of all, I had someone to talk with, and telling stories was Craig's greatest talent. From here on, the voyage would be downright civilized. Before leaving Plymouth, we took the time to get a proper breakfast. Craig could not resist the pancakes with maple syrup, but for me a decadent breakfast is always eggs Benedict. We were both more than pleased with our meal and the coffee that washed it down. As we walked back to the boat, Craig said, "You know, all the wives went over to your house and tore Sheila a new one." I think for a brief moment he got a visual image of what he'd said and laughed. "What wives?" "All of them. My wife, Jack's wife, Pete's wife, Dave's, Jerry's, Paul's. I think my daughter even tagged along." I will admit that for a moment my mind turned to ugly thoughts like, "You reap what you sow." But I was growing increasingly determined that my new life would not be built on the anger of the past. "If it means anything to you, Gloria says she still can't imagine why Sheila did it. She's always said you were an exemplary husband. That's kind of her. Actually, what she says is, why can't you be more like Bill?" Leave it to Craig to make me feel better about my life. As we walked down the pier toward Voyager, I asked, "When are you due back?" "I've got an appointment on Thursday, but Gloria encouraged me to stay away as long as I can." Okay, you know that girl is crazy about you, don't you?" "Yeah, but she has an odd way of showing it sometimes." I couldn't wipe the smile off my face if I'd wanted to. "I was thinking if we have the time, maybe we could spend the day sailing in the bay and then spend the night out at Provincetown. That will open our options for tomorrow, and we can easily make Boston or maybe Portsmouth if the wind holds." "Sounds like a plan to me. Do we have enough food on board? I think I saw a market somewhere." "We've got enough to get by, and Provincetown has lots of great restaurants. We won't starve." So that's what we did. It was great to have the company after nearly a week of being alone. I felt that I'd burned through a lot of the pain of the weeks before my departure, and even though I knew it would return, I was ready to be with other people again. I was ready to be human again. We started out heading southeast toward Barnstable, not that we went that far, and later turned east, and then north again. When we were in danger of reaching Provincetown too soon, we again turned west until it was finally time to make for port. We were just exercising the rig and enjoying the day. Dinner was excellent, and we ended our day by sitting on deck late into the night sipping bourbon and talking. Did you ever learn why? I hadn't thought of Sheila all day and was momentarily caught off guard. Why what? Why she did what she did? No. She said he interested her. I think that's code for an itch she wanted to scratch. She told me that she needed the freedom to explore new horizons, whatever that means. And she just announced that she wanted to pursue this George character? That's what she said, but she admitted they were already going to lunch and dinner and some dancing. The way I figure it, if she was telling me even half of what was true, then she'd already slept with him. She admitted it? She didn't deny it. Damn. That is one cold bit. Sorry. No, she's a bitch. There's no doubt about it now. So that was all the explanation she gave you? It was all I could sit still for. After that, I moved into the guest room and ignored her. She was still coming home late, and I was cooking dinner for myself. When she announced that she was going away for the weekend, I knew that Providence had intervened. I could pack up my stuff and leave without needing to listen to her bitch and moan. I looked over at my friend and said, "It was the first good weekend I'd had in a month." That earned me a muffled laugh, and we ended our night sipping bourbon and watching the people walk past. Day 8, Sunday. We had a decision to make today. If the wind was strong and from the right direction, we could make for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. If not, we could head for Boston, which is closer. We rose before the sun, checked the weather prediction, fixed some coffee and made 2 bowls of cereal, and then decided to head out. I hadn't used the engine very much since that first day, except to get into and out of the harbors and through one canal, so if the wind failed, we could reach a nearby port reliably. The wind was stirring as we left Provincetown, and we optimistically set sail for Portsmouth. The wind was from the west, and we set our sails on a close reach, making acceptable speed on a heading 15 degrees west of north. We'd spent so much time the night before discussing my cruise north and my personal matters with Sheila that we never got around to catching up on the more routine events of the past week. I shook my head in disbelief at all that I had missed in such a short time. Pete got that promotion he was hoping for, Jack's oldest daughter was expecting, and Jerry's wife was pregnant with their third. You can probably tell that we were a group drawn together by common interests rather than age. Craig and I reminisced about the arrival of our own kids and all the changes they brought to our lives. I think we both secretly wished that we could do it all over again, but then common sense and nature prevailed, and we soon regained our senses. Raising children is a young person's game. We were both rapidly approaching the time of grandparenting and looking forward to it. I had it explained to me by my father, who had it explained to him by his father, that the chief job of a grandparent is to spoil the grandkids. He and Mom had earned the right, and I was looking forward to my turn. Damn Sheila and her search for freedom. That was one more thing she had ruined. I could still be a grandparent, but with us living apart we would at best take turns sharing the experience. The wind freshened and back to the southwest, so we eased the sheets, raised the jib, and sailed a broad reach toward Portsmouth. We were now making excellent time, and we spent the rest of the day drinking hot coffee and iced tea, practicing our knots, and telling dad jokes that would make our adult kids groan. That day was coming, too, when they would be telling dad jokes and their kids would groan. Yes, payback was coming. It was getting late in the day as we were closing on Portsmouth, but it was not yet night, and we had another decision to make. We could motor up the Piscataqua River, or we could head a bit easterly and drop anchor at the Isles of Shoals. It was an easy decision. We had food, we didn't need to fight that river current, and if we anchored offshore, we could lie in the cockpit and watch the stars. The little kids and us won out, and we headed for the Isles of Shoals. The Isles of Shoals have limited, restricted access to people, but we didn't need to go ashore. It got cool as the sun set, so for a time we went below to prepare our meal. We had scrambled eggs with some canned meat and chili peppers that we fried in the pan, and tortillas to make burritos. We made a pot of coffee to fight off the evening chill and finished the meal with the last of the cookies that I'd stowed in Annapolis before I left. It may not sound like much, but after a day of sun, wind, and sea, it was a feast. We'd had a long sail up from the Cape. The sun and wind drain a man of all affectations and leaves him wanting something basic, essential, and real. With our jackets on and our bellies and coffee mugs full, we sat in the cockpit and watched the stars slowly rotate overhead. I'm really starting to understand why you headed north, Bill. It's beautiful up here. I just nodded in the dark. The coast up here is rugged and rocky, but there is a seemingly unlimited number of navigable rivers and harbors to explore. As we sat there, fish began to strike the water surface around the boat. Stripers driving bait fish to the surface? Craig said. Either that or blue fish. I suppose it could be tuna. I've never been much of a fisherman. Maybe that's something I'll need to explore now that I'm here. Craig let out a deep breath. I'm jealous, Bill. I really am. I wonder if I could talk Gloria into moving up? I'd been up here in midwinter. If you try, don't bring her in January. Summer is great and fall colors will take your breath away, but winter is intense, and spring is called mud season for good reason. Now Craig was nodding quietly in the dark. I didn't think it was anything more than idle conversation, but 2 years later they moved north. Their kids were grown, and they decided there was more to life than traffic and overpriced homes. His co-workers thought they were nuts, and they were not so quietly planning their retirements in South Carolina. It seems that South Carolina is the new Florida. Bill, are you feeling any better tonight? The question caught me off guard, and I honestly had to think for just a moment about what he meant. Yeah, I think I am. The further away I get, the better I feel. I turned to look at my friend. Can I tell you something that I'm not proud of? Craig just chuckled. Of course. I've been thinking a lot on this sail north, and I keep coming back to the same question. Which is, why didn't I see it sooner? Sheila always wanted more, and she was never satisfied with what we had. I wanted the things that enabled us to do what we enjoyed, and I enjoy this. She wanted a bigger house and more expensive cars to impress her friends. Craig interjected. Can I tell you something that I'm not proud of? I knew this was going to make me laugh. Of course. Shaking his head, he said. We were never all that impressed. So there we were, 2 grown men sitting in the dark under the stars, drinking our coffee, and laughing like a couple of kids. When the wind and the cold drove us below and we closed the hatch, we poured ourselves 2 last cups of coffee and spent another hour passing the guitar back and forth. Neither of us would ever impress anyone but ourselves with our guitar skills, but that didn't matter. It was still the perfect end to the perfect day, and we were happy. We turned in and set the alarm clock for 6. We still had a good sail ahead of us, but it wouldn't be as long as today's sail if the wind held steady and strong. The last thing I did before turning in was to set the GPS alarm in case the anchor failed to hold. We were surrounded by rock that would be remarkably unforgiving if we dragged the anchor. Day 9, Monday. The morning alarm caught us sleeping and we were slow to rise. Neither of us were as young as we used to be, but for these few days we were doing our best to think we were. We decided to start out as soon as we were dressed, and then once underway we could make our morning coffee. There are advantages to having a crew aboard. Once again, the early summer breeze was perfect, and we made good time. We were trying to maintain a course that kept us 5 to 10 miles offshore as we sailed north by northeast along the Maine coast. Looking west to the Pine Tree Coast as we sailed along, I could almost imagine what the first Europeans saw, but of course my imagination was all nonsense. When Columbus arrived in the New World, there were more than 60 million natives already living in the Americas. That was almost the population of Europe at the time. The coast was dotted with communities and even small cities of native people. A century later, there was only 1/10 as many natives. While pondering that reality, it seemed to me that my problems paled by comparison. I watched the horizon as we sailed. There were a few boats out, but not many and none very near to us. As I watched, one by one the towns passed to Port York, Ogunquit, Wells, and Kennebunk. Each passing town brought us closer to Casco Bay and my destination. When we passed Cape Elizabeth, it was like walking through the front door of what used to be my home. I would step over the threshold, drop my briefcase in the living room, loosen my tie, take a deep breath, and then exhale. Only then could I feel the tension leave me. Rounding Cape Elizabeth was much the same that day, and for the first time in 9 days, I felt like I was home. Casco Bay is unlike any place I've ever sailed, with long slivers of rock all aligned in one direction. It was shaped by the last great glacier that passed over this region, carving a record of its existence in the very rock of the earth. Craig and I were in a maritime playground, and we played like 2 kids on the monkey bars at the park. We beat our way between the islands, reached here, tacked there, and took the most indirect path we could find to reach the berth that waited for Voyager. We were laughing with every mile as we put the boat through her paces, and she responded like the thoroughbred that she is. It was growing dark by the time we struck sail and tied up at the pier that would be Voyager's new home. Simply put, It had been the perfect day and the perfect end to my voyage, with a good wind, moderate seas, a capable boat, and most excellent company. We stowed everything below with the promise to straighten the cabin later, locked the hatch shut, and went in search of dinner. After dinner, we just walked. Our berth wasn't in the old port area, I could never afford that. Voyager was tied up where the town grew sparse and increasingly residential, but we found a good place to eat, and the walk was enjoyable. To my surprise, we passed others out for their evening walk and found ourselves in conversation with strangers. If everyone here is as friendly as these, I knew I'd enjoy my new home. Day 10, Tuesday. In the morning I arranged for my rental car to be delivered. Once mobile, we headed to the old port area for a late breakfast and to do some more walking. I needed to walk and stretch my legs. What time is your flight? I haven't booked one. If it works for you, I thought I'd fly home tomorrow sometime. It doesn't matter when. Yes, that worked for me. My solo voyage had burned some of the pain from my soul, and now I was enjoying the company of a good friend who cared enough to see me settled. So, you need to show me your new apartment, and your new office, and… He was deliberately trying to make me laugh. You are such a girl! Still, it was a good idea. I needed to be sure that my new apartment was ready for me, and it didn't hurt to check in at the new office. We stepped through the door of my apartment. I'd been here once before, and I knew not to expect much, but the look on Craig's face told me that he was disappointed. It's only temporary until I get my life settled. It's a place to eat and sleep and keep my clothes. I don't need much more than that. You rented it furnished? I nodded. Yeah. There's no room for your office furniture or any of your tools. Yeah, I figured I'd rent another storage unit until I get a permanent place. He didn't say anything further. He walked into the bedroom, looked around, and nodded. He walked around the living room not saying anything and nodded. Then he stepped into the galley kitchen. He opened every cabinet and said, "Did you bring sheets and a blanket for the bed?" I hadn't. "What about towels?" "Nope." "You don't have enough pots and pans and you need a kettle." He looked a little more. "You need a good crock pot so you can make stew while you're at work." "Do you have a microwave?" I didn't. "We need to get you a microwave. Plus, the curtains in the living room are falling apart." I looked at him and said, "When did you become Martha Stewart?" He smiled a gotcha smile and held out a slip of paper in his hand. "Gloria gave me a list of things to check for. Also, you need a table and lamp in here if you're going to read." I had to admit, when he's right, he's right. I now had a to-do list to keep me occupied and out of trouble for a few days. I checked in at my soon-to-be office, said hello all around, and told them that I expected to be at work first thing Monday morning. Craig nudged the fellow nearest him and said, "Ask him how he got here." I gave them the short version of my voyage north and discovered that I would be working with my kind of people. There were sailors and there were fishers, but everyone skied in the winter. I knew I was going to fit in when they made me promise that I'd give them more details of my voyage in the future and take all comers out for a sail. I was never wanting for a crew again, although I still enjoyed going out by myself from time to time. Every tourist and new arrival in Maine is required by society, if not the law, to pay a visit to LL Bean in Freeport, so that was our next destination. We looked over the canoes and fantasized. We checked out the camping supplies and lied, and then I bought some khakis and dress shirts for work. It was a decidedly more casual office than the one I'd left. That night we slept on Voyager one last time. I knew I would become comfortable in my small apartment, but for now the cramped cabin of my cutter was home to me. Day 11, Wednesday. We rose, dressed, and ate well after sunrise. Today was truly the end of my voyage, and I knew that tonight I would sleep in the bed of my new apartment. I'd sleep on Voyager again when the desire called me, and I would spend many weekends exploring the coast, but it was time to begin my transition back to a life on land. I took Craig to the airport and said goodbye, then went shopping for a table and lamp along with some linens. The last thing I did that day was to move my clothes, books, and guitar from Voyager to my apartment. I was settled in, and it was no more difficult than that. As I loaded my possessions into the car and prepared to depart for my apartment, I turned for one long look at Voyager and watched her bob and tug at her lines. She was a thoroughbred anxious to get back to sea, and I knew that soon we would go exploring together again. I'd started my voyage sailing north, hoping to leave the pain of one life behind as I searched of a new life elsewhere, but somewhere in the wind and the waves, or maybe huddled below in my cramped cabin, Voyager and I had made a bond. With her help, I had been transformed and was now ready to face my new life ahead. Epilogue. The kids called almost nightly once they knew I was settled. I was talking with them more after my move than I did before. It seems once they had time to think about it, they understood my decision. A few weeks after I was settled in, I flew back to Maryland on a Friday evening after work and spent the night in a local hotel. Saturday morning I met my friends for breakfast, and then they helped me load the truck. It was a small truck and we filled it easily. Before I could load my car on the trailer, I drove back to my old house. It hadn't been much more than a month, but now it seemed a lifetime ago. My voyage was complete. I knocked on the front door, and when Sheila answered, her face went from surprise to confusion to condescension. She invited me in, and we sat in the living room. She had that damn smirk on her face, so I let her start. "So, are you finally over your little snit and ready to get back to the marriage?" I might have treated her better if she had said anything else. "No, I'm not coming back." Her smirk dissolved and she just stared at me. It's funny how someone who betrays you can go on to think that they are somehow indispensable in your life, as if you could never get along without them. "I have a new life now, and I'm not coming back. You made your decision, and now I have made mine. The best thing you can do is just sign the papers and we can both get on with our lives." She tried to deal, and she tried to plead, and she offered up just about everything other than George, but there was no going back. A man hopes that his wife will love him, but more than that he needs for her to respect him. Sheila didn't respect me. Somewhere along the way I'd lost her respect if I ever had it at all, and there was no point in wondering where. Soon I was driving the truck and trailer north, following the path that I had sailed not so many weeks before. It's funny how my preparations for moving seemed daunting at the time, and now somehow my old life fit easily into a small truck with my books and tools in the back and my guitars in the cab beside me. Much like then, I spent the night alone some distance north of New York City, and in the morning, I completed my second solo voyage north. This time, I was returning to my life instead of looking for it, and I knew that come what may, I would enjoy the years ahead of me. I did find love the second time around, and I do have friends both old and new to share the voyage with, but that is a story for another time. As for Sheila and George, I sometimes fantasized about revenge, but I knew that was just the pain and anger talking. I worked to replace the pain with joy, the isolation with the company of good friends, and soon Sheila became just one more occasional problem and George was of no importance at all.